to manage the laptop as well, but I'm sure it will be all right tonight. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting us to this, to give this presentation today, to join with you in the conference. I'm talking to you as a parent and a grandparent of 10 grandchildren, as much as the social worker that I started out as my first ever jobs 50 years ago. 10 years as a social worker in Birmingham, and then a long time being a social work academic. But what I'm going to talk about today, what we're going to talk about today, is research that we've been engaged with over the last 10 years, looking at inequalities in the child welfare system in children's social care, inequalities affecting children's life chances. And I think at the heart of that research, we were trying to grapple with a critical question as to whether children's social care services reflect social inequalities, whether they reverse and improve, mitigate social inequalities, or whether in some respects they may make social inequalities worse. So we're going to raise with you this morning some pretty hard questions, I think, to deal with against the background of recognising that almost everybody in this field has good intentions. I was beginning to think about this talk, plan this talk, in the week that both Josh McAllister's review of children's social care came out and the National Review of the Deaths of Star Hobson and Arthur Minjo Hughes came out. And as I read both of those reports that week, they both raised to me the question about the way in which discussion about child abuse and neglect is framed in this country. And particularly the absence of discussion of the socio-economic context of child abuse and neglect. The McAllister Review actually made some very strong points about the importance, the relevance of poverty and inequality to children's social care. But the impact of those arguments was diluted, to my way of thinking, by its judgment that those issues were outside the scope of the review, and that therefore they could make no recommendations about poverty and inequality. They were just seen about the effect of that, and I know Josh McAllister, because I talked to him about it, didn't really intend this, but I think the effect of it is to say that socio-economic factors are distant issues. They're part of the wider context, they're part of the background. Whereas I think that for all families, but particularly for families in poverty, the amount of money you have, the resources that you have to support your parenting are far from a background issue. They're the most immediate issue. Are you going to be able to put the heating on if it's cold? Not today, in that situation. Are you going to be able to feed your children tonight? There's nothing more immediate than those kinds of issues. And in the National Review of the 2 dreadful cases of child deaths, there are extended accounts, if you read that report, of the child's family circumstances over time, covering many pages. But I can see no mention of the socio-economic context in which they live, no mention of the source or stability of their family income, no mention of employment or work any of the parents were doing, no sense of locating the family in the context of the neighbourhood in which they live. Just some generalised statistics about their local authorities, as if all parts of those local authorities were equally affluent or equally deprived, when that's totally not the case. So I'm not saying that socio-economic factors were necessarily crucial in those 2 cases. I don't know. But I do think that such a complete absence of discussion of those issues leaves us with only a partial picture of those families' lives. And I think it's telling that such a significant review can be published without any discussion of the economic context. This absence is also seen in the National Guidance on Child Protection Working Together, which contains not a single mention of poverty, income, debt, employment as a factor in the lives of children and families in 116 pages. There are 78 mentions of help in working together, but none of them suggest that material resources might be at least part of what some families need, one thing that can make a difference between managing and not managing, between being a good enough parent or not being a good enough parent. And incidentally, being a number of mentions of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, in the last few minutes, and I'm not against ACEs, but the standard definition of ACEs include no reference to poverty. They raise a whole lot of other issues, but not poverty. And the same mindset is reflected in the statistics that are collected by the DFE about children's social care. So the data that we collect in England and in the other UK countries and report on and analyse is good quality, it's fairly comprehensive about how children progress through the system, but there's absolutely no information collected about the socio-economic circumstances of the families. None at all. So while the whole emphasis of children's social care government policy over the years has been on the parents' responsibilities, with the state stepping in when parents aren't managing, the DFE has no data about the parents of the children who receive the services, nothing about their age or marital status, nothing about income and debt, employment, housing, nothing about the quality of their immediate neighbourhood. So as a country, we spend over £10 million a year on children's services, and we don't know who the parents are that the services are for. We have no data, no basis for planning what help parents need so that their children can stay with them rather than having their primary relations fractured, while the state incurs spiralling costs. Long preamble about how I think we need to view the children's social care and child maltreatment system. And this matters to me, to my mind, because the most important influence on a child's chance of experiencing abuse or neglect, being separated from their parents or siblings in care, is their family's socio-economic circumstances. There's a very steep social gradient, as we call it, in the likelihood of a child being investigated for abuse or neglect, being put on a child protection plan or taken into care. Most of, Callum Webb of Sheffield calculates, 3/4 of all the differences between local authorities in the number of children on child protection plans or in care, the rate at which children on child protection plans or in care. 3/4 of that is explained by socio-economic circumstances of the families. It's by far the largest single factor affecting children's life chances. So let me show you through recent bits of evidence about that. This is a chart, some of you may have seen something like this before from the Child Welfare Inequalities Project. This was a large study that I led and Will was part of, where we looked at the experience of thousands of children in local authorities all across the country using data from 2015. Because we don't know the economic circumstances of individual families, we had to link the families that were receiving children's social care to the deprivation scores for the small neighbourhoods in which they live, and then divide those small neighbourhoods into 10 groups, each with 10% from the most deprived to the least deprived. This is on the left-hand side, number one, the 10% of neighbourhoods with the least deprivation, to at the far end, 10% with the most deprivation. And these columns show the rates for children on child protection plans And the chart shows very obviously a steep and consistent social gradient in the proportion of children who are maltreated or in care, and a huge inequality in life chances. So in the most deprived decile, the most deprived 10%, one child in every 35, just 1 in 35, is either on a child protection plan or in care on a single day in 2015, 1 in 35. In the least deprived decile, it's fewer than 1 in 400, a 12 times difference. So these are not minor inequalities, these are huge inequalities in children's life chances. And it's also important, I think, to see that if you compare columns 1 and 2, so we're talking about the two most affluent, two least deprived 10% of neighbourhoods in the country. Even there's a gap. And what that, I think, tells us is that, of course, the lack of money, if you're living in poverty, then the lack of money is a crucial issue which affects your parenting. But it's not just about poverty, it's also it's not just about lack of resources, it's also what resources can buy to support your parenting if you're well off. So, it's about the additional childcare you can buy, it's about the holidays, it's about the experiences you can buy your children, it's not having to worry about bills, all of those things. So this is not just a straight line across until you get to poverty and then the numbers go up. Each step, you see this increase. And that has to be thought about when you're trying to explain the relationship between socio-economic circumstances and the child who's in effect. The second table, and I'm absolutely not expecting you to take in what this chart says in detail, but you can look it up in the references if you want to follow this up later. So this is taken from work by Rick Wood and Annie Goldacre at Kingston University. And one of their key measures is the steepness of the social gradient. How much difference each step increase in family circumstances makes to children's chances. The steepness of that gradient. And it shows, first of all, that the gradient, this steep social gradient, is confirmed for every stage of the process, from referral, through assessment, through case conferences, through put on a child protection plan. At each stage, there is a steep social gradient. And it shows, secondly, that if anything, the gradient becomes steeper the further into the system a family goes. So the system is more unequal for children in relation to child protection plans than it is for children being assessed. It's more unequal for children being assessed than it is for children being referred. So having more resources not only protects your child from needing referral in the first place, but if referred, it's less likely that they'll end up in a child protection plan or in care. And thirdly, this chart also, this table also shows that in low deprivation authorities, the gradient is much steeper than in high deprivation authorities. And that's a point I'll come back to later. It's just part of the picture that we have to understand. This is a complex issue. There aren't simple one-to-one relationships. And I'm just pointing up some of the things that we have to think about, some of the things that we have to explain behind the statistics. And the third of these charts comes from a study conducted very recently, published only a couple of months ago by the DFE, by the Department for Education. As I've said, we don't have household level data about the circumstances of families whose children are in contact with children's social care. And so in our research in the Child Welfare and Policies Project, we couldn't be absolutely certain that that link to local neighbourhood deprivation schools really reflected the families who were in contact with children's social care. It's likely to be the case, but we couldn't be certain. What the DFE have just done in a project looking at drivers of demand, because of their power in government, they were able to get from HMRC data about individual family level income. And I was delighted to see that this did show exactly the same social gradient as our methods and Rick Wood's methods have found. So 3 completely different projects using different data sets at different times, but finding an absolutely consistent result of a profoundly steep gradient, highly, very large inequalities in children's life chances, children's chances of abuse and neglect. So there is no doubt in my mind, your chances of experiencing a state intervention for abuse and neglect is very strongly related to parental income and employment. Now that's what I call the demand side of children's social care intervention rates, how levels of need in families influence children's chances. The supply side, how services respond when they get a referral, is the other side of the equation. And here there are structural inequalities too. So there's been a lot of policy focus in the past decade on variations between local authorities in rates of intervention and what they spend on children's social care. In the middle of the last decade, government and Ofsted and the National Audit Office put variations between local authorities down to leadership. They said variations weren't structural. It wasn't about the deprivation of the local area, it wasn't about the funding, it was about leadership. And they said that neither the quality of services reflected deprivation or funding, that's what they said. But more recent analysis led by Callum Webb again in Sheffield and Delara Bennett in Liverpool has shown that all those positions are wrong. There are structural factors at work here too. Local authorities that are least deprived, but most unequal, have a social gradient 5 times steeper than local authorities with high deprivation but low inequality. And Ofsted judgments are reflective of funding level, expenditure levels, and deprivation too. Low deprivation local authorities and high spending local authorities are likely to get better Ofsted outcomes. But you might say, hang on a minute, can we be sure that it's really income that makes the difference, rather than other factors which perhaps correlate with that income, like parental mental health, domestic violence, as we talked about earlier? Perhaps it's the other way around. Perhaps it's that these other factors tend to lead families into poverty, rather than being poverty per se as the problem. Well, we've conducted I conducted recently with a colleague called Guy Skinner, a literature review of the evidence in the last 5 years on the relationship between poverty and child abuse and neglect. And we found 18 what we call quasi-experimental studies, which are the closest you can come in this field to a randomized controlled trial. These studies, almost all of which are from the USA, use differences or changes in income benefits or sudden economic shocks like mass employment layoffs to compare 2 equivalent populations, either 2 populations at the same time in different places, or population in the same place but over different time, where there's been a change in the economic circumstances between the 2 populations, where in fact the only difference between the 2 populations is the economic status, the economic circumstances of families. And every single one of these 18 quasi-experimental studies found evidence of a statistically significant difference in the rates of child abuse and neglect, where the only thing that had changed was the level of family income, or the level of employment. These are just two examples. I'll just mention one of them, the second one there. This was a study which through modelling, found that a $1 increase in the minimum wage, $1 an hour increase in the minimum wage, would produce a 10%, nearly 10% reduction in reports of neglect. So this is that's just a kind of a simple way of expressing their findings. But the crucial overall was that nothing else had changed in these studies except the economic circumstances of the families. So you can be sure that it is resources, it is the economic circumstances that are making the difference. So we think that the evidence is very clear that the socio-economic status of families is a contributory causal factor in child abuse and neglect. It's vital for understanding child protection that we view these population-level patterns of activity and outcomes, and the economic and social context of such activity, as well as, obviously, studying individual cases. And if you think about it, this inequalities perspective has long been established in health and in education, and the source of major policy efforts to reduce the gaps or cut inequalities. But it's scarcely been the focus at all until very recently of child welfare research and policy. And of course, sadly I'm not really going to have time to talk about this today, of course in addition, interacting with these broad patterns of socio-economic inequality, we have to study intersectionality, how gender, age, ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation play out in children's lives. I'm happy to talk with you about those later over lunch or whatever if you want to follow it up. But there just isn't time to do too much about that now. But I do want to talk about just one recent paper from the USA, which has suggested a gendered relationship between parental employment and child abuse and neglect, because it's a particularly striking and challenging example to think about. What Lindo and colleagues suggested is that an economic shock that shifts the distribution of childcare from mothers to fathers. For example, more mothers moving into work, or working longer hours, or fathers becoming unemployed, may increase the incidence of abuse. They argue, and it's controversial, I know this is controversial, because we don't usually confront this. They argue that evidence shows that fathers are more likely to be abusive to their children than mothers for every hour spent in their care. So while any study of abuse and neglect needs to look at pattern and distribution of resources between families, we also need to look at the distribution of resources within families, between mothers and fathers. I'm not absolutely straightforwardly endorsing all of that research, but I think it's well done research, and it confronts an issue that one of the many complex issues that we need to think about in looking at this stuff. So these ways of looking at harm to children have to be brought to bear on how we understand the causes of harm. The most common two models that we use to explain the relationship between poverty and child abuse and neglect are called the investment and family stress methods. The investment model focuses on whether parents have the resources they need to meet their children's needs. And it assumes, rightly, that almost all parents want to invest resources in their children's development and well-being. Even though this is called the investment. It's not just about resources. Because having enough money to meet your children brings with it feelings of self-worth and also some bargaining power in managing social relationships. So it's about emotions and relations as well. But the family stress model focuses essentially on the sort of physical and mental health consequences of that, including stigmas and shame.
Very complex needs. And at times, the practice narratives from social workers could also reflect a focus on personal responsibility. So actually, whilst when we asked social workers about socio-economic circumstances and poverty, they offered really complicated explanations of understanding of the relationship between poverty, child abuse and neglect. There were also instances where social workers demonstrated the need to refund or reimburse that kind of money. What we learned was that actually getting somebody's bus fare back might trigger a bureaucratic process that would take you almost all the way around the local authority, so that by the time the decision was made, which may or may not confirm that that bus fare could be refunded, would be sort of 3 or 4 weeks down the line. Now, for a family member who's making decisions about whether or not they can agree, then the £4 or £5 is certainly not inconsequential. But the systems that social workers work with make it very difficult to support families with those kind of small bits of money, but that would make a big difference to some of the families that we spoke to. So we spoke to a lot of social workers who have really, really good intentions, who are trying their absolute hardest within very difficult and constrained conditions to support families. But the conditions that social workers are working with certainly meant they were limited in terms of the extent to which they can think about poverty, the time that they can give to working through the complexities of this, and the mechanics and specifics of what they could offer to families, both within their social work teams and beyond that within the local authority, because of the extent to which services within the voluntary community sector beyond have been eroded by austerity. So this was a difficult picture in that respect. And of course, what some of these conditions reinforced for families was a sense that social workers weren't really there to help. So when we talk to families, these are some of the things that we heard. Social workers talk down. They show up with their suits and the badges and their ties. They'll cause hell for you, they get to take the kids away. Now, interestingly, when you drill down in a bit more detail, when we spoke to individuals within the community, there were a number of people who had fairly positive experiences with social workers. I had a good social worker, she came and she helped me out with X or Y. But the dominant narrative within the community was absolutely about these horror stories of social work practice being stigmatising and traumatising for families. So there are a few things, when we analyse the data, a few themes that families expressed in relationship to the social work that they would like to see. First impressions count. So our respondents hoped for social workers who were able to interact in a way that was human, in a way that was empathetic and humble. Debt advice services, food banks, income maximisation services within the local community, when people knew about them and could access them, were described as lifelines, as extremely important. But these sorts of services were not associated with social work. Child protection social workers were seen as offering something completely different and much more punitive in terms of the response. So from family perspectives, there's a real disconnect there, which is sort of borne out in social work, which is like, that's how what we do in practice. Services from local agencies like children's services, job centres, schools, social work, were experiencing quite judgmental and difficult to work with. And there was something that I think was really important here about the impacts of that on families' help-seeking behaviours. So we heard a number of respondents in the community say they've had awful experiences at the job centre or elsewhere, and those experiences coloured their expectation of what social workers might be able to offer them. So a stigmatising experience in one space might influence somebody's capacity or propensity to seek help in another space. And this has really clear implications for families. So there's an extract here from a conversation. It says, it makes you not want to deal with these so-called professional organisations. You start withdrawing from them. You approach people asking for help, and when they treat me in that way, you think, well, I'm not going to go back there, Why should I go back? I'm not getting any help, just a load of grief. Why am I going to put myself through that? You just get on with it, get on with it quietly. And Lucy, who we spoke about earlier, told me that she'd suffered from anxiety and mental health for her whole life. When she had her first child, she was really, really struggling. And she felt like she needed to go to the GP, but she was too afraid to go to the GP because she felt like social services might get involved and her children might be removed. So there's some complicated stuff going on here, which is really important to acknowledge, I think, about the experiences that families have across the different agencies and the impact of those for help-seeking behaviour when times are really tough. Our families talked about social work responses that were more flexible and open to perhaps less normative expectations of family practices, so recognising the diversity of the ways in which families practice. And then finally, and this relates I think to some of the comments that were made earlier by Darren and Asha, there was certainly room for much better connections between the social work and some of the local organisations that were offering debt advice and maximisation, that notion of partnership working. There were some really obvious gaps in the services that we met in this local authority, but those connections weren't happening. So we spoke to a great service in the local community who offered longitudinal employability support to families, and they told us that they'd really like to see more referrals from child protection social workers, but those referrals weren't coming through. When we spoke to child protection social workers, they said there's no services for us to refer families to. There's some of those services that exist, but there wasn't always a clear connection. And one of the other things that we noticed, which is perhaps something to do with this, is that lots of social workers didn't have a clear understanding, a detailed understanding of the patches that they were visiting. Social workers told us that they were reliant on their sat-navs to get in and out of the neighbourhood, and they didn't build up a clear memory, therefore, of the specifics and dynamics of the neighbourhoods where the families were based. Often those social work services were located on the edge of the city. They weren't always within the spaces which were generating the most demand, and this meant that social workers didn't always have a clear picture of what was there in the communities where the families really needed their support. So I hope that gives you kind of quick insight into some of the experiences of social workers and families on the qualitative side of the city. I'm going to hand over to Paul to finish off.
Thanks, Will. Because we're slightly over time, I'm going to skip over that slide, which was basically saying that there's now clear evidence that prevention does work in terms of reducing demand on children's social care. So when you see the slide, you can follow on that reference, but we're a bit over time. I think just to sum up what Will's been saying and how that fits with the story that we're trying to tell, is that it seems to me, and I said I was a social worker. I know the good intentions of people who work in the system. But one of the killer pieces of evidence that we're not getting this stuff right is the wide distrust by families of the current system, that it's seen as a source of threat, not as a source of help. And I think that one of the consequences of social work practice not seeing socio-economic circumstances as core business means that families don't feel that they're understood. They don't feel that some of their most critical needs are heard and listened to. And that's just alienating. It stops people approaching services for help even when it would be available. And even when they do approach for help, they don't necessarily get And that has an effect it has an effect on the relationship as a whole, which goes beyond just that, in a sense, tiny incident. Our study our work hasn't been studies of what works in this context. There'll be stuff about that later on in the day. But I think it would be wrong to leave you without giving some suggestions as to what we think matters, or what might make stuff a bit better. And I think the key underlying point is, I don't think this is just about spending more money. If we spend more money but still do the wrong things, then we won't be making stuff better. We may end up with more children on child protection plans, more families alienated from the system. So it's critical that we shift the focus of the work that's done to a service that is much more about helping and supporting families to stay together and preventing problems escalating. And I think that needs to operate at 3 levels. I think it's absolutely crucial that it begins with national policies that take many families out of poverty and economic insecurity, especially deep and persistent poverty, which have been growing so much in recent years. And I think that's both a matter of substance and of tone. So it's about it's not only about the amount of money available through different systems, but it's about the ways in which those are administered. So it's about taking out the hostile environment that surround the immigration and benefit systems, as well as the substance of what they do. There's clearly a role for children's social care services, allied with other services, as Will's been saying. But that too begins with national government, actually. It's not just about local authority, because national government holds all the levers for this. National government is responsible for funding, how it's allocated, they're responsible for guidance, they're responsible for the inspection regime, they're responsible for data collection and analysis, they're responsible for the legislation. So all the framework for local practice begins at the national level. But this change does also require frontline staff taking poverty as a central, taking poverty of family socio-economic circumstances as a central issue in everything that they do, through income maximisation, through devolved budgets that would make those sort of payments easy to do, through actively linking families to resources. But particularly in all the conversations with families, demonstrating empathy, demonstrating the understanding that money and resources matter, and how those work out in relationships. Above all, there's a need for this fundamental resetting of the relationship with families. We need a service which families feel is on their side in a society that gives every parent and every child a fair chance. Thank you.